Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast. We cover everything Major League, from spring training to the World Series. We've got your favorite club covered, from New York to Boston to LA. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Ridenauer, and we've got another wonderful show lined up for everyone listening today. Thanks so much for joining me here today. Hope you all had a really good week and are ready for the weekend, are getting geared up for Thanksgiving. I'm actually going out of town for the holiday to see my family, so that'll be nice. Obviously not having a huge family gathering, but something small to try to keep things as normal as possible with the outside, circumstances in the world. But regardless, we have a really fun episode planned for today, a lot of news in the baseball world, so I'll get right to it, and I'll first jump into some news going around the league and any of the latest updates about free agency and any signings and rumors that have been going around the MLB. I'll then get into some of the likely landing spots for Fransico Lindor this offseason and discuss which landing spots MLB.com thinks could be the best and biggest destinations for the star shortstop. After all of that, I'll jump into the Hall of Fame finalists for this year and mention who they are and which finalists I could see making the Hall of Fame and which I don't think will have a chance of making it this year. And be sure to stick around for the final minutes of the show as I'll discuss what baseball is going to look like in 2021 and how next season might play out with possibly having fans in the stands. So a really big episode ahead of us, a lot of things going on in the baseball world and a lot of just kind of uncertainty again with next year and the season that's going to be coming up soon, in 2021 with are there going to be fans, are there not going to be fans? But again, that's going to be coming up in a little bit here. I want to stay right here in this first segment discussing some latest and greatest news. And there's been some recent developments in the MLB world with some recent signings and some teams potentially making some trades. Some might not. But I'll jump into some of the news. And the first thing I want to touch on is the recent signing of Mike Clevinger by the San Diego Padres. Now, as we all know, Clevinger came over there from the Indians during the trade deadline, a huge trade deadline this past year for the San Diego Padres. They picked up Clevinger, they picked up Trevor Rosenthal, they picked up Austin Nola as well. They also picked up Mitch Moreland, who was having a great year when he came over to San Diego. So a lot of really added pieces that San Diego was going after. And I think that signing Mike Clevinger to this 2-year, $11.5 million deal is a very smart move. Now, here is the catch, though. He's going to have Tommy John surgery this offseason, so that's going to put him out for the entirety of 2021. And I believe in 2022 is when his contract actually, I don't know if that's going to be technically the first year of his contract since he won't be playing in this year, coming up in 2021. So I don't know if that's going to push things into 2022. And then his contract will be up in 2 or 3 years from now. I have no idea what the details are of that exactly, but I know that it's kind of interesting that they still signed him even though they knew he was going to be getting the surgery. And I think that also goes to show you how much of a valuable player he is, that the San Diego Padres, who have now become a contending team, a team that is most likely going to find themselves in the playoffs many times in the next couple years, especially with the personnel that they have and with the team that they've been able to build, they must really see something special in Clevinger. And you know what? The guy is really good. I mean, he had a phenomenal year when he was in Cleveland, and then obviously he had some off-the-field issues with not following COVID-19 protocols, really kind of rubbed a lot of his teammates the wrong way. He was actually demoted at one point because of that, him and Zach Plesac both. So that is the one thing that I am very interested about and very curious about, is how his off the field and kind of how his personality and his character and how his ego really is going to mesh and fit with the San Diego Padres. Because everything that I have seen and everything that I have watched from this Padres team is that they are even though there's a lot of stars on that team, it's a very together team. They don't seem to try and take the limelight from one another. One guy is not trying to really, be the main stage player in the whole for the entire team. Obviously, Fernando Tatis is kind of the big name on the team, and Manny Machado. But again, there's so many other guys that were big names. I mean, Jay Cronenworth had a great year. Will Myers. Then you've got I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Trent Grisham, another name that to throw out there. So you've got a lot of different guys that are very impactful for this team. And so I don't know how Clevenger's kind of, mentality is going to fit with that. And if any of the off-the-field things that have been going on with him in the previous, months in this past season, how that's going to affect it. But I will say, no matter what, his talent is going to work very well, and his pitching ability is going to work very, very well with this starting rotation for the Padres. I mean, just think about this 1-2 punch that they will have once he is back. Him, Mike Clevenger, and Dinelson Lamet. Those two are going to be feared 1-2 combos in the NL without question. And I think that once he does come back, we're going to see drastic improvement overall with the Padres. And who knows what they're going to do this upcoming year in terms of how well they're going to perform and what they're going to do in the NL West. But when Clevenger comes back, it's going to be interesting to see kind of the difference with him on the team versus with him off the team. When he came to the Padres, he pitched in a couple games, 3 or 4 starts. I believe he had a 2.84 ERA when he came over to the Padres. So he did do very well once he arrived in San Diego. Obviously ran into some injury problems, and that really set him back. But in all honesty, I think that this rotation is going to be very scary when he comes back and when he's in full health form, because him and Lamet both were very good this past year. I mean, Lamet was a top 10 pitcher in strikeouts and ERA. I mean, the guy did it all this past season. I personally thought he was a little bit snubbed out of being a finalist for the NL Cy Young Award winner. So having a potential NL Cy Young Award winner in Lamet, and then who knows how Clevenger is going to be after the surgery. Now, that's the other question, is what if Clevenger is not the player that they are expecting or they're hoping for after the surgery, and he's never the same player after? You always hear those stories about guys that have this very serious injury and they have this surgery and they come back and they're just not the same. So will Clevenger be the same pitcher he was before this surgery? That's going to be a big question for me. And if he's not, what are the Padres going to do from that point moving forward? Because they clearly are paying him a decent amount of money over the next couple of years. Now, obviously, I think they're trying to be careful because it is a 2-year deal, so they're trying to, keep themselves in check a little bit. They don't want to spend too much money because right now it is a little bit, wishy-washy whether or not he's going to be the same Clevenger he was before after the surgery. So I think they are just keeping all their ducks in a row and making sure that there isn't any sort of issues that arise down the road. But I'm really excited to see how Clevenger continues to perform and really develop with the Padres. Now, there's also been some rumors going around, but some possible trades. Again, possible trades. And one of them, one of those players that's name has really floated around the trade rumors and constantly is floating around in the trade rumors is Josh Hader, closer for the Milwaukee Brewers. And he's always, it seems like every year, at least the last 2 years, he has been in some sort of trade negotiation, or at least there is some rumor floating around with Josh Hader. And I am always intrigued by that because, A, he seems to be a very sought-after closer and a very popular reliefman, and obviously he should be. I mean, he's been one of the best closers in baseball the last 3 years. And I think any team, especially a contending team, would be very intrigued to have him and have, him coming out of their bullpen. I mean, look at a team like the New York Yankees. They've got a shutdown closer in Aroldis Chapman. If you're going after, Josh Hader, you could see possibly a team like maybe, obviously the Dodgers have Kenley Jansen, but maybe the Houston Astros, somebody that's a little bit more dominating. I'm not quite sure who they have right now at closer, but I know that, there's other contending teams that could possibly go after, or try to make a trade with the Brewers for Josh Hader. And another team that just popped in my head were the Atlanta Braves. Mark Melancon is going to be a free agent, so there is going to be some pitching that's going to be freed up here a little bit. Now, I know Melancon has been in and out of the bullpen. He starts some, he doesn't start some. So, that could open some things up for a team that is really going after some pitching and that really needs some pitching, especially out of the bullpen. And I think that's going to be something that they could, and again, they've got plenty of pieces that they could trade for. They've got a lot of talent on that team, so they could ship, Melancon, or once Melancon, or if Melancon does not re-sign, then this offseason, then they could go after and make a move on a guy like Josh Hader and try and make a deal with the Brewers, who clearly are lacking in hitting right now, and they need to bolster that in some sort of fashion, and that's what the Braves have to offer, a lot of hitting. So it's going to be, I think, some team is going to offer up a lot for him because he is a very valuable player. Now, obviously, he's had some off-the-field issues. Some of those, racist tweets that he tweeted so many years ago did resurface, so that might also come into question. But I think ultimately, teams are kind of looking past that right now because, it was so long ago. He addressed it. We've moved on from it. And I think now, we're going into this kind of off-season with, is this the year that Josh Hader does get traded? Because, again, that has been something that has floated around the league for at least the last 2 years, maybe even longer. And, again, nothing usually happens. He doesn't usually get traded. But I do think that, Milwaukee could be looking to deal him to potentially try and free some salary up, to also go out and get some much-needed pieces for their hitting and in their lineup to really try and, again, take a lot of the attention off of Christian Yelich. I think that's the problem right now, is that pitchers are able to target Christian Yelich so much, so easily because there's not a whole lot of other threats on the team. It's not like a team like the Atlanta Braves this past year where you had to worry about Freddie Freeman, but also Ozzie Albies, Ronald Acuna Jr., Marcell Ozuna. You had other people that you had to worry about. Same thing with the White Sox. You had to worry about Jose Abreu, but you also had to worry about Eloy Jimenez and Tim Anderson and Nick Madrigal and, Yasmani Grandal, and the list goes on. So Milwaukee doesn't really have that. And as a result, I think that they really need to go after some hitting, and I think this is an opportunity for Josh Hader to be dealt. He had an incredible year this past year. He had a 39.7% K rate. His ERA was a 3.79. So he obviously has been playing well, and he's still a productive player. It's just a matter of where he could land and where he might wind up. So, again, I'm going to keep my eye and ear open to that one and seeing where he might land up and where he might, get traded to if that does happen. But definitely something to keep an eye on in this offseason. And then another big name in the free agency market that could maybe make their way to our neighbors up north in Toronto, Canada, playing for the Blue Jays, could be George Springer. The GM for the Toronto Blue Jays expressed his desire to go out in this offseason and spend some money, which is a little interesting because there's also been a lot of GMs like the Cleveland Indians that have mentioned that they want to try and limit as much salary that they have to spend on players this year. That's a lot of the reasons why the Indians want to get rid of Francisco Lindor to free up some salary space. And again, because of the COVID-19, all the pandemic losses that they've had to deal with financially. So it's very interesting that the Blue Jays seem to really want to go in and try and spend some money here this offseason. And I think that they could really benefit from other teams not wanting to do that. They could take advantage of that. Plus, it's a young team. They made the playoffs this past year. Charlie Montoyo, he's been a great manager. He was a finalist for the year for the Manager of the Year award in the AL. So you already know that they're going to try and make some sort of move, whether it's for George Springer or not. And another thing is they already have a great outfielder in Teoscar Hernandez out there. If you are able to surround him now with George Springer, that would be a pretty solid outfield right there. A very solid outfield, actually. And George Springer, he's a very valuable player. He's a very sought-after, free agent. He's one of the bigger names in this market. He could make up to probably $20 million a year this year. And I think what could intrigue him enough is that it is a young team. It's an impressionable team that he could be a part of and really be a part of something special and maybe try and make a serious run with them one year. They obviously have Vladdy Jr., they have Kevin Biggio, they've got Bo Bichette. I've seen a lot of things where they might even try and make a move for Francisco Lindor, and if they do that, if they're able to make a trade for Francisco Lindor and then somehow, some way still have enough money to pay George Springer for however long, you're picking up an incredible shortstop, an incredible outfielder. When you already have a great shortstop at Bo Bichette, you'd have to probably, do some moving around in the infield with him and Lindor if that were to happen. But then you'd also have the addition of George Springer. So now you're just really building on to this past season that they had that was really, I think, a kind of a nice surprise, especially in the AL East. It was interesting to see, the Rays and the Blue Jays both being up there with the Yankees, and the Red Sox kind of falling by the wayside. Now, I'm sure the Red Sox are, secretly plotting their next move or whatever, but I know that this Blue Jays team is really going to try and go after some big-time free agents this offseason. They've already signed Robbie Ray, so they're making moves. They want to try and really build off of this year, and I think going after George Springer is exactly what they need to do. I think that would be very interesting for them. Now, some teams have also been on the move with signing players already. Some guys have started to really, get signed and find themselves on new teams, and one of those teams is the Atlanta Braves. They've actually been very active. They've signed 2 pitchers, Drew Smyly to a one-year $11 million deal, and Josh Tomlin to a 1-year $2.5 million deal. I think it's a pretty smart move for them to go after pitching. Clearly, the pitching in the regular season was lacking. Now, in the postseason, it really picked up. Ian Anderson is one name to throw out that was sensational in the playoffs. And then obviously Max Fried. Fried was, I think it was at one point or another, they had won either 13 or 14 straight games that he started. So that just shows you how much of an impact Fried has on his team. But to go after Smyly and Tomlin, I think it's a good move because you are addressing the pitching. But I don't know if they are the personnel that you need. They're 2 lower to mid-30s pitchers. They didn't really do anything spectacular in the past 2 years or so. Smyly has been injury-prone. I think it is kind of a gamble to go after these veterans. I do think that Tomlin can, maybe start and also come out of the bullpen and kind of be, a swing pitcher, if you will, do a little bit of both. But I just don't know if they were the pitchers to go after. I think that they definitely could have maybe gone after some other guys that were a little bit more realistic. I know, and again, I mentioned Mark Melancon just a couple minutes ago. They could have tried to re-sign Mark Melancon. I've always been a big fan of him. When he was in Pittsburgh, when he was in Washington, it seems like everywhere he's gone, he's been pretty effective. And if they were able to keep him around, I think that definitely would have benefited them in the long run. But again, they did go after 2 solid pitchers for the most part, 2 guys that were needed, but they did, again, at the end of the day, they've addressed and they are still addressing that need for the pitching, and because it's clear that that's kind of the difference maker in this team. They've got the hitting, they've got the ability. Even if they lose Marcell Ozuna, they still have a ton of hitting across the board. Now they need to address the pitching, and I think they can become a much more well-rounded team. And there's been even more front office moves now. Again, a lot of things have been changing. A lot of things have been going on. I honestly I am anticipating a really big offseason if these are just the beginning moves that are being made. But recently, Theo Epstein, the main really responsibility for, or remain, the one that is responsible for building the Cubs into the powerhouse that they've been over the last 10 years or so, Theo Epstein has now stepped down and resigned from his role as president of baseball operations for the Chicago Cubs. This is a pretty big blow. Epstein, again, another guy who seems to everywhere he goes, everywhere he goes and everything he touches turns to gold. He was originally with the Boston Red Sox, and he was instrumental in bringing them 2 World Series championships in 2004 and 2007. Then he comes to Chicago, builds an incredibly, dominating team, all of the, pretty much the entire 2010s, wins a World Series there in 2016. So he's been a vital piece to snapping 2 teams' curses that they've had for years. A 108-year curse for the Cubs and an 86-year for the Red Sox. He's won 3 World Series titles between the 2 teams. He's been able to build up a dominating NL Central powerhouse in the Cubs. So I definitely think that's going to be a big blow for him. I think that, again, he was responsible for making a lot of the trades that were able to bring in guys like Ben Zobrist, Wilson Contreras. Really, again, a lot of that stemmed from his ability as, an executive and a front office guy in baseball. Now, his replacement, Jed Hoyer, is taking over, and I think that Hoyer is going to be a nice replacement. I obviously don't think that he's going to be, the level that Epstein was, but, he's also been very successful, too. He was, at one point or another, San Diego's GM, and he actually, that one lone year he was there, he led them to one of their few 90-plus win seasons in franchise history. So right there, that shows you also that he's capable of this job as well, and he's been side by side with Epstein. They actually go back to their Boston days together, so he was there with him in Boston. He's built winning teams before. He's been a part of winning teams. And Hoyer's actually also helped expand the Cubs scouting and analytics department. So also very important parts of baseball these days is analytics. Hoyer's had a lot to do with that, and he's had a lot of kind of say in what's been going on in behind the scenes with the Cubs. So I honestly do believe that Hoyer will be a nice replacement. I think that Epstein eventually will find a new team somewhere. A lot of people have been saying that he just wants a break from baseball right now and that he kind of wants to just decompress and unwind and walk away from the game for a little bit. But again, don't be shocked if Epstein winds up finding himself back on some major league's front office or, being an executive somewhere, because the guy definitely knows how to build a team. He's very good at it, and he's done it many, many times. And if you're able to bring in, I can't remember what it was exactly, but the article I was reading said that out of all of the World Series, all the guys that were on the World Series team for the Chicago Cubs, he was responsible for trading for, I think, 13 of the 15 main pieces to that World Series team, or, he was responsible for bringing in, 8 of that 9 starting lineup of that year, whatever it might have been. He was a big, big part of their success. So a kind of a big blow for the Cubs. I do think that Hoyer will step in nicely, but ultimately they're definitely going to miss Epstein in that front office. But a lot of news has been going on. A lot of different things have been moving around. I'm really looking forward to see, where DJ LeMahieu winds up, another big name in free agency, JT Realmuto, obviously Trevor Bauer. I'm just excited to see kind of where guys eventually land and which teams are going to be going after these guys, because I think it's only going to continue to get interesting from here in this offseason, and I think that we are in for a fun ride, honestly, in the game of who's going to sign where and who are going to be the new faces in these new places this upcoming season. So a lot of things to look forward to on the horizon, but that'll do it for us in this first segment. But stay right there, folks, because after the commercial, I'll get into the likely landing spots for Fransico Lindor and which destinations MLB.com feels like that he could really wind up in. Folks, stay right there. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA, to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Jack Ridenauer with you all. And in our first segment, I got right into some of the latest news going around the league in the MLB with some recent free agency signings and everything in between. Make sure you stay right here with me for the final few minutes of the show, as I will get into a conversation on what baseball in 2021 will look like in terms of going to a game as a fan, and how the game day experience might be drastically different than anything we've seen before. I want to now get into some of the destinations that MLB.com has picked for where Fransico Lindor might land, and then whether or not I agree with them on their selections. So there's a lot of teams that they mentioned. I think it was about 7 or so that they mentioned that could be likely landing spots for him. And again, Lindor is not a free agent this year. He's a free agent next year, but the Indians do want to trade him, and they have expressed their desire to do so in order to save some money for their salary. So the first team that MLB.com mentioned that he could be, or could be a good fit for him would be the Blue Jays. Now, the Blue Jays would be interesting without question, mainly because of the fact that they do have a lot of young talent. Young, promising talent, and they have expressed a desire to go after some big-time players this offseason. As I mentioned, they may go after Springer. I talked about that in the first segment, which would probably deter them from going after Lindor. And 2, they'd have to give up a considerable amount of prospects to the Indians for Lindor, which they do have, as they have one of the best farm systems in baseball, but I don't know if they're going to want to give up that much for Lindor. They have a great young infielder in Bo Bichette, and he is already at shortstop. But many people believe that they can just move him or Lindor over to third, and that would really expand their infield. Not to mention, it would also improve the overall fielding, because Bichette has had some struggles over at shortstop in the recent years. So bringing in somebody like Lindor, who is one of the top fielding shortstops in baseball, that would definitely boost their infield, fielding overall exponentially. They would have to give up maybe even more than just prospects, and MLB.com seems to think that Lourdes Gurriel Jr. would have to be included on this, and I think that it would be a big loss getting rid of Gurriel. He's had great numbers in Toronto, and if they go after Springer and maybe another free agent, then I think it'll save them the trouble of having to get rid of a blossoming talent in the MLB in Gurriel. I mean, he's batted just shy of 300 for his career in Toronto, so somebody that has definitely had a big impact with the Blue Jays since his time in the league. And Lindor is also a free agent in 2021. So he could get out of Toronto after a year, which I think a lot of these teams are skeptical of, because if there is any sign of struggle for the team he lands on, he'll be gone after a year. And I think that if they don't make many other moves in free agency, then they could do this. But I feel like they'll just, make some big splash this offseason with either acquiring Trevor Bauer or George Springer. They have clearly expressed their desire to spend money. So they are going to go after somebody. It's just a matter of who, and it's just a matter of will, they add that free agency signing with a trade for Lindor if they're going to financially be able to afford that. Now, will this work? Probably not, unless they don't do much in free agency. But if they do, then it won't. I just don't think that they want to spend that much money. I don't think they want to spend a heavy load for a couple guys, and one of them potentially going to be, out of Toronto after a year in Francisco Lindor, depending on how they do. So I ultimately don't think that's going to work out. Now, the next team that could be very interesting, I think, is the Philadelphia Phillies. And Didi Gregorius, who was their shortstop this past year, he had an all right year, had a pretty solid year, nothing spectacular, but nothing bad. He is a free agent this season, and so is JT Realmuto. So some salary is being freed up, and they are already hand-tied with Bryce Harper, and they're going to be tied up with him for many years. And he's making an insane amount of money. So this could be something to keep an eye on. But here is the issue. The Indians would probably receive many prospects from the Phillies, and some of those prospects are shortstops, which would be intriguing since the Indians would be losing a shortstop, but a lot of their top-tier farm system players are shortstops. So if they won't give up Baum or, maybe some other pieces for Lindor, because Alec Baum had an incredible season this past year, I don't think this will work out. But I circle back to the point of losing Didi. If he is gone and not re-signing, then this will be a very interesting situation for Philadelphia, because their options off the bench for a backup are slim, as they only had two players off the bench that batted above 270, and one of them was their backup catcher in Andrew Knapp, and the other one being the backup center fielder in Adam Haseley. So either way, they don't have a ton of guys really to fill that void at all. So it's clear that the hole over at shortstop would be glaringly obvious. So I could see, this being a possibility if the Phillies are willing to give up a little bit. And would this work? Yes, like I mentioned, it just depends on if Philly is willing to give up, but if what they're willing to give up. But if they are stubborn on what they will offer, then no way. Cleveland has a lot of control in this situation, so it's going to have to fit their needs most importantly, because they are the ones with Lindor right now. So as a result, they're kind of, I don't want to say in control of their own destiny, but they kind of are, because they can kind of say yay or nay on any sort of trade offer for Lindor. Now the next team, a fellow Ohio team, I honestly am kind of puzzled as to why they had them on the list, and that's the Cincinnati Reds. This was a very kind of confusing pick for me on this list, and I didn't really understand why they were there, because I mainly don't think that the Reds have much to offer in terms of a solid trade. They already spent over $170 million from last year upgrading their team with Nick Castellanos and Mike Moustakas, and I just don't see many other players that can be intriguing enough for a team like the Indians to want to go after. The Reds would have to probably really shelve out a ton of prospects for the possibility of Lindor coming. And not to mention, they have no other pieces to offer. They have nobody really to offer. Nick Senzel is the one name that comes up on MLB.com's potential players that they could possibly trade. And I don't think the Indians want an outfielder who hit 186 last year on their team. Sure, he covers a ton of ground, and the Indians need help in the outfield, but they need help with the hitting in the outfield, not necessarily the fielding. And I just don't consider getting Senzel for Lindor as an upgrade, rather a major downgrade, in my opinion. Ultimately, this would probably never happen. And the one point that MLB.com makes about how these two teams have made trades before, I know Yasiel Puig was the subject of a trade, obviously Trevor Bauer, but that isn't going to sway the Reds in any direction, I think, in them wanting to unload 4 to 5 prospects for a shortstop that may or may not stick around. They already, they're enduring a big-time free agent name potentially leaving Cincinnati in Trevor Bauer. So I don't think they want back-to-back years of that, obviously. They don't want to go after a guy in the offseason just to have him leave the following year. And again, I'm going to continue to make that point throughout this segment because that is a major factor in all of this. Whether or not Lindor and that team mesh well for this upcoming season, this could be the only year he's on that team, and then he's just going to bounce out of there and leave in free agency. So that is, again, something that teams need to make note of and pay attention to. But ultimately, I don't think this would work with the Reds. So the next team that I definitely could see this and I think makes a lot of sense is the Yankees. it would make a lot of sense, I think, because there is the fear that LeMahieu won't re-sign with the Yankees, so that would free some space up in the infield and their salary. Yes, the Yankees do have Gleyber Torres over at shortstop already, but similar to the Blue Jays situation, you can just potentially move infielders around, shift Torres over to second, or even put Lindor at second. MLB.com makes a good point about the possibility of trading Clint Frazier over to the Indians, who drafted him a few years back as their number 5 overall pick, and not to mention, his OPS jumped 100 points from 2019 to 2020, and he hit a career high in the last 2 years. Sure, it was only 267, but he'd still be a nice piece in the outfield, which, again, the Indians need to address. I mean, their hitting was atrocious in the outfield, and he would be a nice addition for them. And with LeMahieu potentially out as well, this would maybe free up some salary to maybe try and re-sign Lindor the following year after he is a free agent. I don't know if people really realize that whether or wherever he goes this year, it's going to be essentially a tryout for both Lindor if he fits that team, and for the team wherever he lands, whether or not they will like him, and if he performs, for them. So obviously going to be a big kind of experimental year for whomever it's going to be. So it's just going to be an interesting kind of situation to see how he lands and where he lands, and that's why teams really need to be careful about what they throw out for Lindor. Because in a year from now, that team could go from losing potential star players in a trade for a player that wound up leaving after a year. So then that would really, not go in a lot of teams' favors. But ultimately, I think that the Yankees could definitely benefit from this trade. I just think that, they need to hope that Lindor will re-sign after this upcoming season. I think that's going to be the biggest question mark, is if the Yankees do go after him and they're able to move their infield around, will he wind up sticking around for the long haul, or is it just going to be a one-and-done kind of year? Now, the next team, fellow New York team, they're crosstown rivals, the New York Mets. This could mutually benefit both teams because they can fill the void for the Indians. Again, the Indians can fill the void in the outfield because the potential trade, or at least what MLB.com says, would include Jeff McNeil, who is a star in the making. He has been sensational since his time being with the Mets, and they could really get some solid prospects from the Mets as well. The Mets would receive Lindor, of course, but another name on the list is Austin Hedges, their backup catcher. And honestly, you look at his numbers and you see a career 198 average on top of the fact that the Mets are really pushing to get Real Muto. At least that's what all of the rumors are saying. Sure, Hedges is a great defensive catcher. So is Real Muto. And they mentioned that Hedges is one of the best framing catchers, but so is Real Muto. So I think that in this situation, if it was McNeil for Lindor and then prospects were thrown in as extra compensation, that would work much better. Because the Mets want a good defensive catcher with a great bat, which is exactly what JT Realmuto provides. I think the Indians would actually win this trade because they would upgrade the outfield play with McNeil, and him and Jose Ramirez would be side by side in Cleveland. That would be a great 1-2 punch. I just don't think the Mets will want a poor hitting catcher with good defensive skills. They need as many bats in that lineup because they are forming something special, I think, in New York, especially if they get Real Muto. I think that they could be the difference maker in them making the playoffs, in all honesty. I just really think that, whether or not this works, I think it's going to really come down to if a catcher, is or is not involved in all of this. Because they're going to want to go after good catching, I think, and they're going to want to go after players that are going to add something to their hitting. They definitely don't want to bring in a catcher that's batting below the Mendoza line. And just because, the Mets, they're going to want to, be careful also about giving up potentially good, prospects, and they don't want to get a guy that might stick around or might not stick around in Lindor after a year, and then they're also left with a really just poor catcher that just completely fizzles out in the long run. So I think that, in all honesty, between the two New York teams, the Yankees makes much more sense than the Mets because, again, although the Mets do have what the Indians don't have and what they want in really good outfielding, again, the Yankees can give them the same thing. So I just think that it's just a matter of, is a catcher going to be involved or not, because the Mets do want to go after some good catching. So the final two teams that they mentioned would be potentially good fits, the first one being the St. Louis Cardinals. Now, this is another intriguing possibility, mainly because, again, both teams have a little bit of what the other wants. The Cardinals need a legitimate bat in their lineup, and in the infield, especially since Paul DeJong has been lackluster at best, but the Indians could get a big addition in their outfield with Tyler O'Neill. I will say Tyler O'Neill has been lacking at the plate recently. He's a great fielder, though, very fast, covers a lot of ground, and he does have the potential to be a very good hitter. I mean, his 2019 numbers weren't half bad. He batted .264, a 106 OPS plus with 12 homers. He had 15 stolen bases. So not only is he going to get it done from the plate, but he can also, be a great setup guy to move over and to get put into a, scoring position. So that could be an intriguing thing for an Indians outfield that had one of the worst combined OPSs in the MLB with a 575 clip. Problem is, if Lindor doesn't stick around after next year, then the Cardinals will lose out on getting to keep O'Neill if he improves and reverts back to his, normal self. And they've expressed a desire to save money this year, like the Indians. And next, obviously because of the pandemic, so that they could also that could also maybe hinder their chances at being, a potential landing spot for Lindor. And not to mention, it could also hinder their opportunity to maybe re-sign Lindor the following year if he does stick around to stay. Ultimately, I like the idea. I just think it's too high of a risk for the Cardinals to take, and I just don't think that this will work out because, again, the Cardinals have too much to lose in this situation, and it would be a high-risk, high-reward kind of thing. And if they want to go in on that, then, sure, go ahead. But, again, with how Yadier Molina has been declining, I think we're starting to potentially start to seeing kind of a rebuild. I don't want to say a rebuild because they were still pretty good this past year. They still made the playoffs. But we are definitely starting to kind of see a rebuild phase, or kind of a, not starting over, but just going back to the drawing board, if you will, with the Cardinals, because I think a lot of players are starting to phase out. Matt Carpenter is also getting old, and I think that they're going to start doing a lot of kind of moving around and just fixing up of their team in the next few years to ultimately put themselves into a really good position. And I just don't think right now, financially, they should go after Lindor because he would be a heavy load to carry on anybody's salary. So the final team that could potentially be a spot that he could land in is the LA Dodgers, the reigning World Series champions. And this would obviously work. Sure, you'd have a little bit of an overload in the infield with, but you can just move Corey Seager over to third. He's your other shortstop, and obviously, Taylor at some point or another may or may not be playing at short also. You can just move guys around. You could put Lindor over at third. Now, the other question for the Dodgers is, what will happen with Justin Turner? Because if he comes back, then it would make no sense because there is no way they will take Seager out of the lineup and especially out of the infield. The potential trade MLB.com outlines is sending Dustin May and Matt Beattie, which would be very interesting. But I honestly don't like that because I think May has the potential to be a superstar, and the Dodgers already have a star at shortstop. Not to mention, they could just go after one of the big-name shortstops in free agency next year. I mean, there's some huge names in next year's free agency at the shortstop position. I know that you've got Francisco Lindor. You've got Trevor Story. If I'm not mistaken, you either have Manny Machado or you've got somebody else that's up there that is going to be a highly sought-after person. So next year's really going to be the year of the shortstop, and I think that they could maybe just wait it out and just see what they can find in free agency next year. And you don't have, and again, you wouldn't have to, give up a potential ace in the making in Dustin May. I mean, May looked great this year, especially in the playoffs. Beattie wouldn't be bad to throw in the trade, though. He had a little bit of a down year this past season, but in 2019, he was a solid hitter. He had a .265 average. He slugged .458. Now, the average obviously dropped 40 points from 2019 to 2020 as he was floating around, .225, .220. But I think that Beattie would be a solid fit at first for them. But again, not a fan of them getting rid of May. I think that's, there's just too much promise in him for them to get rid of him. And like I said, I think that, they'll maybe go after a big name in free agency at the shortstop position next year, or they could just keep Seager, who clearly is on his way to being a superstar. Whatever happens, I think that the Dodgers are very mindful of, they have a lot of things going for themselves, and not to mention, they're not like one of these teams like the Cardinals or the Indians that are going to probably take some sort of financial hit. Sure, they probably have at some point or another, but they haven't taken the hit that I think these other mid-market teams, well, I mean, they're not even a mid-market team. These mid-market teams are going to go through and are already going through. So it's going to be really interesting to see where he lands. I mean, it's almost, kind of a big, this is going to be a big changing year for a lot of guys. There's a lot of big names in free agency. There's a lot of rumors with all these trades that have been going on. And again, I think the main thing with Lindor is this, that you have to kind of take into consideration in this situation with wherever he's traded to. A, is he going to re-sign with you the following year? That's going to be another big question. You do not want to have a situation where he's only there for a year and then he leaves, and you've potentially given up an arm and a leg for the guy, and he's not even with the team after a year. And then B, depends also on who teams go after in free agency. If the Blue Jays go after a guy like George Springer, and then there's also been rumors about them wanting to get Trevor Bauer, that's going to really tighten them up a little bit in terms of, finances and on who they can pay. And they're not going to want to pay Lindor a heavy fee. Now, unless they start just dealing guys and they start getting guys off payroll and they start trading people, then maybe. I could maybe see that. But they've already started, with re-signing or signing guys, with Robbie Ray signing a deal with them in free agency. So it's going to be interesting. Again, will Lindor stick around with whatever team he's on in 2021? And B, whatever kind of free agents these teams go after is going to really affect, Lindor's status in the trade market. But I'm going to be very, very curious to see where he winds up, and I'm really excited to see, once that news breaks, how he kind of fits into that new system and that new team. So that will close things out here for us in our second segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Thanks again for tuning in. Coming up after the break, I'm going to discuss the recent release of the Hall of Fame finalists for this year, and I'll mention which finalists have the best chances at being inducted into Cooperstown. It's been a lot of fun so far, but we got a lot more to go, so don't change that channel. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be, visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Great to have you all here still with me today. Jack Ridenauer again, and in the last segment, I jumped into discussing the recent MLB.com article about the different landing spots that Fransico Lindor could go to, and whether or not I agree or disagree with those selections. I want to now head into this next segment, highlighting the Hall of Fame, finalists and who the finalists are for this year's induction class, and which finalists I think will have the best chance to make it into Cooperstown. There are a lot of first-time names on the ballot this year, and for me at least, a lot of names that I remember well from when I was growing up as a young baseball fan. So I want to run through some of these names and just briefly go over their careers and mention which players I could see really making it to the Hall of Fame. So just running through all of the names really, and then I'll kind of get into unpacking them and who they were as players and whether or not they'll make it into the Hall of Fame or not. First guy, Bobby Abreu, and then Barry Bonds, obviously a name that probably many of us know, Mark Burley, A.J. Burnett, Roger Clemens, Michael Kadire, Dan Herron, LaTroy Hawkins, Todd Helton, Tim Hudson, Torrey Hunter, Andrew Jones, Jeff Kent, Andy Pettit, Aramis Ramirez, Manny Ramirez, Scott Rowland, Curt Schilling, Gary Sheffield, Sammy Sosa, Nick Swisher, Shane Victorino, Omar Vizquel, Billy Wagner, and Barry Zito. Now, looking at a lot of these names, there are some that stand out as for most part, for many reasons, because they are probably surefire, I think, inductions into the Hall of Fame. Some that are on the fringe, and then some that I don't think will ever make it in. So I'll get through, which players I could see getting in and which I don't. First guy I got to mention that I was looking at his career numbers, and I'm a little puzzled as to why he's in kind of the finalist for the Hall of Fame and on this ballot is LaTroy Hawkins. Now, he has no career highlights. He was never an All-Star. Never was, a major impact player in any sort of regard, was never, highlighted or mentioned for any sort of awards or whatnot. His career numbers are, I think, kind of dismal. I mean, 75 and 94 is a record. He had a 4.31 career ERA, 983 career Ks. He had 127 saves. Now, this is the one thing that I think a lot of people are kind of looking at and saying, okay, he could potentially make it in the Hall of Fame if he obviously probably had a little bit more, statistical background, and as well as, just in general career highlights. He had a 21-year career in the MLB, which for anybody is incredible to have. If you're able to make it past 5 or 6 years in the MLB, you must be doing something right. He's somebody that I don't think will make it. I don't think that we'll ever see Hawkins in the Hall of Fame. I think that there's another player very similar to him who played quite some time, Jamie Moyer, another name that gets thrown out there. He's not on this ballot, but I don't think that, again, very similar. Both of them never really had major career highlights. I believe Moyer was an all-star 1 year, but other than that, nothing real spectacular. So I think guys like that who don't have anything really to show for in terms of being able to get voted into the Hall of Fame, it makes things a little bit more difficult. It makes your case a little bit more challenging to make against, a committee that is going to be voting on who the best and who the greatest and who the cream of the crop were as baseball players. Now, getting into some other players that I think that, are potentially kind of fringe players that I was actually very pleased to see their names on this list, one of them being Mark Buehrle. I mean, Mark Buehrle was a very good baseball player when he played. He had a great career with the Chicago White Sox. He was a 5-time All-Star. He won a World Series with them. He was a 4-time Gold Glove Award winner. He pitched a perfect game, and he pitched a no-hitter. So 2 very, very, huge monumental milestones in his career that were able to occur for him not simultaneously, but at one point or another in his career. And I think that having, Mark Buehrle in the Hall of Fame, I honestly could see that happening. I don't know if he will make it on the first try. I don't know whether or not his name's been on the ballot before or not. I'd have to double check that, but I think that he's somebody that could eventually make it in. He had pretty solid career numbers for the most part. Nothing spectacular. He had a 214 and 160 record. A couple wins shy of that 300 mark, because they usually say for pitchers you have to have at least 300 career wins to even get any sort of recognition or get any sort of potential, nod in their favor for the Hall of Fame. He had a 3.81 career ERA, and he had over 1,800 career Ks. So clearly he was another guy that had, a lot of success, wasn't, a major guy like, some of these other names like Roger Clemens, who, was a 7-time Cy Young winner, but he definitely was a very good baseball player, and he was definitely at one point or another one of the better pitchers in the MLB during his time. And I just think that eventually he will get in, but it might be, well down the road. He is deserving of it, I think. I mean, throwing a perfect game and a no-hitter in the same career, that's no easy task. There's, I think, only been 23 or 24 perfect games ever in the history of baseball, and Mark Buehrle has thrown one of them. And I'm not going to lie, he was a great fielder. And I always reference this, replay that I remember from many, many years ago. Mark Buehrle is going and approaching a slow roller down the first base line. I can't remember who they were playing, but he runs over, he grabs it, he flips it. I think he pretty much picked it up with his glove, flipped it over his, behind his back, and got the out at first. I couldn't believe he did that. It was on SportsCenter, I felt, for weeks on end back in, whatever year that was. But it was pretty incredible to see, not only a guy that could dominate on the mound, but he was also, mobile. He was a, agile pitcher that was able to field, because a lot of people don't realize, if you're a pitcher that can't field, that really could pose some problems, because you never know if you get one hit right back to you and you need to make the play, you need to make the throw, or if it's a ball that's kind of in an in-between area between third and first and, where the catcher is, you might have to go and claim that ball and go and try and get that out. And again, that comes to obviously communication and everything else in that. But being able to be, agile and being able to be mobile enough to get off the mound, grab the ball, pivot, turn, and make a perfect throw to first base, it's one thing pitching and being able to throw strikes and being able to be accurate. But the other thing, it's another thing to be able to, in one motion, picking a ball up again, going, turning, and throwing towards first, all in the same motion while trying to beat out the runner. That's another challenge in itself. And Mark Buehrle made that look effortless for many years, so I think that he'll eventually get in. But another guy that I want to mention that was just as good of a fielder, actually he was an even better fielder, to be honest with you, Andruw Jones. Andruw Jones was I mean, for 10 years, he was one of the best outfielders in baseball, if not the best center fielder in baseball. I mean, he was a 10-time Gold Glove Award winner. He won it from 1998 to 2007. He was a 5-time All-Star. He won a Silver Slug Award winner. He won a Hank Aaron Award winner for being, the home run leader in the NL one year. MLB home run leader, NL RBI leader. I mean, he was really good. And then not to mention, he wound up going and playing in the Japan League, and he was an All-Star and a Japan Series champion while in Japan also. So he was a guy that was able to play, through different levels, but also he was able to excel in the MLB for years on end. And he was a fun player to watch in center field. I mean, he was kind of, somebody that you almost guaranteed that one evening or another, you were going to see some sort of highlight from Andrew Jones, whether it was a home run robbing grab or a diving catch or whatever it might have been. Now, his career average is okay, 254, not great, but I will say something that is going to, I think, jump out to the committee when they vote on this. He had 434 career home runs. So like I mentioned, 300, career wins usually is a good benchmark for pitchers. 500-plus career home runs is usually a pretty solid done deal that you're going to get in the Hall of Fame as a hitter. Obviously, there's not a million guys out there that have 500-plus home runs, but if you have, 350, 400, close to 450 in a career, you're also going to get, noticed for that without a question. Because being able to do that over a long period of time and being able to put up those kinds of numbers, I mean, that's not easy to do. And not to mention, he was a great fielder on top of it. So I definitely think that he is going to get into the Hall of Fame before Mark Burley does. But I think that both of them would be, without question, in my opinion, future Hall of Famers in some, fashion or another. And I think that also, not to mention, Andrew Jones was part of some very good Yankees teams. And I think that's going to also stand out to, a committee when they vote on this and whether or not they should allow him in. And I think that at the end of the day, you have to kind of look past the average that he had. Again, not a great average, but those home runs and the fielding, he was able to do two different things at a very high level and excel at both. So as a result, he should, I think, get in. Now, another outfielder that's on this list that was just as good of a fielder, Torrey Hunter. I mean, Torrey Hunter was a guy I watched growing up, playing, watching the Twins and watching all those really good Twins teams from, the middle of the 2000s or so when they had Johan Santana and they had Francisco Liriano when he was young. They were a really fun team to watch. And one of the main guys on those teams was Torrey Hunter. Torrey Hunter was a great fielder. He was a 9-time Gold Glove Award winner, 5-time All-Star. He was a 2-time Silver Slugger. And he had a pretty solid hitting career as well. Batted .277, over 2,000 hits. He had 353 career home runs and over 1,300 RBIs. So somebody, again, very similar to Andrew Jones. I like to compare Hunter and Jones because, in all honesty, they were both 5-time All-Stars. And then, Andrew Jones only has them beat by 1 Gold Glove. And they were winning Gold Gloves simultaneously. And from 1998 to 2007 were all years that Andrew Jones won, and then from 2001 to 2009, those were all years that Torrey Hunter won. So again, they overlapped each other perfectly, and I think at that point in time, they were one of the best outfielders in baseball. And so I definitely do believe that Hunter will get in also. Again, it's whether or not he'll get in on the first or second or third ballot. A lot of these guys, I mean, you're looking at some of these names, Torrey Hunter, Andrew Jones, Jeff Kent, another guy, Tim Hudson, another guy. They're fringe Hall of Famers. They could make it. In my opinion, some of them should be in the Hall of Fame. Like I mentioned, Torrey Hunter and Andrew Jones. They would definitely get votes from me, especially with their home run numbers, their ability to field. They were able to do multiple different things on the baseball field and at a very high level, and they played for a really long time. I mean, Torrey Hunter almost played 20 years in the MLB, from 1997 to 2015. So being able to be that durable as well as a player and to last that long in the league, that's something pretty incredible to talk about. Now, some other guys that I want to mention, A.J. Burnett, he's one that I was a little bit kind of iffy on. I'm not going to lie, I did not realize how many career strikeouts he had. He was only a 1-time All-Star, played for many teams, played for the Yankees mostly for a lot of his career, but he also played for the Blue Jays, I believe, at some point or another. He played for the Pirates some. I mean, the guy bounced around from place to place all the time, it seemed. And he did have, a 1 year where he won the World Series with the Yankees, and he was an AL strikeout leader. He also played for the Marlins. He also played for the Phillies. He actually played for the Pirates 2 separate times. He pitched a no-hitter in 2001. So, I mean, he did have some nice highlights there, but they weren't anything, I think, that spectacular, right? There's nothing on his resume that jumps out to me that says that guy should be in the Hall of Fame. Now, I will say over 2,500 career strikeouts is something to definitely take note of, but he doesn't even have 200 career wins. So my question is, if you're going to give A.J. Burnett the benefit of the doubt being on this finalist list, you should also give the benefit of the doubt to Mark Buehrle. I mean, Mark Buehrle had a way better record and way better statistics and a way better resume than A.J. Burnett ever had. And I think that there are some other guys on this list that is, again, I go back to LaTroy Hawkins when I first started the segment. Not quite sure why he's on this list. Okay, yeah, he played 21 years, but if we're just going to give out, Hall of Fame recognition to guys that didn't actually have Hall of Fame careers, they just lasted a really long time in the MLB, I don't know if that can really live up to the standard of what is, a Hall of Famer. What does it mean to be a Hall of Famer? And there's been other guys on this list, other pitchers, I should say, that kind of had okay, careers. They were kind of just average. And, I mean, they were, good for a period of time, but they weren't great. They weren't Hall of Famers. Dan Herron is one. I mean, he was a 3-time All-Star, and that was about it. From 2007 to 2009, he didn't really do anything else that spectacular. He had a record of 153 and 131. He did have a 3.75 career, ERA and over 2,000 strikeouts, but he wasn't somebody that is going to jump out to me and say, wow, that guy is a Hall of Famer without question. So Dan Herron, LaTroy Hawkins, A.J. Burnett, probably not going to make it. I don't see them being Hall of Famers at all. Now, Andrew Jones, Torrey Hunter, Mark Buehrle, yeah, those would be my fringe guys that would definitely make it, in my opinion, and without question. I mean, some of these guys on this list, that is taking them a long time to finally get the recognition they deserve. One of them is Omar Vizquel. Vizquel's been on this Hall of Fame ballot for years. I mean, years. And I think this could be the year he finally makes the Hall of Fame. He was an 11-time Gold Glover, and he was a 3-time All-Star, and he played for, a long time. I mean, he played from 1989 to 2012. That quick math right there. I mean, that's about, 90 to 2000 would be 10, 2000 to that, over 20 years in the MLB. So quite some time for a guy to last that long, and he was that good at fielding at the shortstop position. And now, mind you, he was winning the Gold Gloves even into the 2000s. I mean, he won 3 Gold Gloves in the 2000s, in 2001, 2005, 2006. He also had some pretty solid hitting numbers. He had almost 3,000 career hits. He was at 2,877, which is another kind of milestone that people like to look at, whether or not somebody could get in the Hall of Fame. 3,000 hits, 300 career wins for pitchers, 500 or 400 career home runs for, hitters, stuff like that. Those are absolute dead set milestones that if you check those boxes, you should get in. And, I mean, he was just a couple hits shy of that. So I definitely think that Vizquel could make it in the Hall of Fame. I do think that he's deserving of it. And I think that he's been, somebody that has, been, at one point or another, he was one of the top infielders in baseball ever. And I think that he's, again, he's always considered one of the best, fielding shortstops to ever play the game. So I think that Vizquel will eventually get in and still, find his way into the Hall of Fame. Now, I'm going to, discuss, one or two other guys before I'm really going to get into the 2 players that I think everybody knows that I'm going to reference. Well, I should say 3 players that I'm going to reference that I'm really not sold on them getting in the Hall of Fame, even though their resume would speak volume to them being in the Hall of Fame. Now, another guy that I'm not sold on in getting in the Hall of Fame is Nick Swisher. Swisher was okay. I was never really a huge fan of Nick Swisher. I never thought that he was that good. A one-time All-Star. He won a World Series with the Yankees. He played a little over 10 years. Nobody spectacular, right? He wasn't a great player overall, I would say. I will give him this benefit of the doubt, though. He did hit at least 20 home runs in each of 9 consecutive seasons from 2005 to 2013. So that is pretty hard to do in baseball. But other than that, his career home runs you would think are much higher than that. He only hit 245 career home runs. He had a 249 career average. So again, not really that spectacular of numbers. So some of these guys that are on this list, I'm kind of puzzled as to how they got on there. And I don't know if it was just their importance on the teams that they were on or their longevity in the league, whatever it might be, whatever the kind of criteria is being met for this. But I think ultimately having them, on this list, I think is taken away from other guys that could maybe make this, list and be inducted in the Hall of Fame. Now, I want to get into a couple names that I think everybody knows I'm going to bring up. Barry Bonds, obviously, Roger Clemens, of course, and Sammy Sosa. three guys that were dead-set steroid users, or at least were massively implicated in a lot of the Balco allegations, and then everything that came out years later after that. I think it was the can't remember the name of the investigation, or the Mitchell report, I think it was. Just a bunch of stuff that came out with a lot of these high-profile names using these supplements and these steroids to make themselves better. Now, Roger Clemens, you look at his career numbers and you say, yeah, he's a Hall of Famer without question. 11-time All-Star, 2-time World Series champ, 7-time Cy Young Award winner, which is astronomical when you think of. An AL MVP winner, 2-time Triple Crown winner. He was a 4-time MLB wins leader, 7-time ERA leader. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. He won over 300 career games. He had a career ERA of 3.12, and he had over 4,000 career strikeouts. So just think of that. A.J. Burnett had over 2,500 strikeouts, and I was just floored by that. Roger Clemens had over 4,000. He had over 4,600 career strikeouts. Those are astronomical numbers, and when you look at those numbers, you say, yeah, he should be in the Hall of Fame. But again, everything that circled around him, everything that was kind of that cloud that was hanging over his head for years in terms of the steroid allegations and everything, that has to be a blemish on his resume. And again, I know I talked about this a couple episodes ago, whether or not steroid users should be in the Hall of Fame. So it kind of brings me back to that whole kind of discussion. Should they be or should they not be in the Hall of Fame? I personally don't think so. I don't think Roger Clemens should be in the Hall of Fame. I don't think Barry Bonds should be in the Hall of Fame. I don't think Sammy Sosa should be in the Hall of Fame. Why? Well, if something that they were doing then is now outlawed, how in the world are you supposed to allow them to get in with a free pass, but then other guys that could probably benefit from using those supplements nowadays aren't allowed to use that, and so they don't have that added edge? As a result, you're kind of giving, the benefit of the doubt, giving a little leeway to guys in previous generations and in previous years that, I guess, at that time, baseball didn't really know the significance of using human growth hormones. So as a result, guys were able to get away with it. Guys weren't being tested for it. People weren't really looking at it in the way that they do now in a cheating fashion. But at the end of the day, it's cheating. No matter what you look at and no matter how you look at it, Roger Clemens cheated in baseball. And he used, supplements. He used something that he should not have, and it made him a much better baseball player. Same thing with Barry Bonds, 4-time All-Star, 7-time MVP, 8-time Gold Glove Award winner, 12-time Silver Slugger, 3-time Hank Aaron Award winner, batting champ, home run champ. The list goes on and on and on. Not to mention he's the all-time home run king with 762 career home runs. He had a .298 career average. He had 2,935 hits and 1,996 RBIs. So some really heavy numbers from Barry Bonds. But again, I go back to my original point. He was a big-time steroid user, or was at least implicated in a lot of it, and there was many allegations against him. Now, I would have to look back at the court case. I don't know if he was actually found guilty or not, but there was a lot of things that I'm pretty sure he was found guilty of something. I don't know what it was, but it's just that whole, I think, idea that his name was in the conversation. And just by having his name in the conversation, it has to throw a blemish on his resume and his chances to get in the Hall of Fame. Same thing with Alex Rodriguez. I'm not going to give him any sort of, pass either. Because, again, he was another guy that, yeah, sure, he might have not used it at certain periods of time, but he still used it, no matter what. And so even if you take away the years that he was using it, he would maybe still have a Hall of Fame career, but he would not have the career that he ultimately had. And so I think that is where, a guy like Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens, they might take away the opportunity of a guy like Mark Burley or Andrew Jones, who I personally think is much more deserving of getting in because they played the game honestly. Now, I can't remember. I'd have to go back and check. I believe Andrew Jones was actually in a lot of steroid allegations. I could be wrong on that. But somebody like Torrey Hunter was not. Torrey Hunter was not in it. Jeff Kent is another guy. He was actually very outspoken about, and he was a 5-time All-Star, won a couple Silver Sluggers. He's the all-time home run leader for second baseman. He was an MVP at one point or another. So that's a guy that could get shortchanged, who had a really good career. He was outspoken about steroid use. And it was a foregone conclusion that him and Barry Bonds did not get along well because Jeff Kent was so against his steroid use. So that should be another kind of inkling into whether or not Barry Bonds should be in the Hall of Fame. And I personally just don't think he should be. I don't think that there's any way you can legitimately give a pass to somebody that has done that. So ultimately, I think there's a lot of deserving guys on this list. I hope that the committee makes the correct decision and gives the induction and really gives the honor to the players that deserve it and not the guys that cheated. Because, again, if you're going to reward cheating, then you might as well just allow it today. Why are you going to outlaw steroids if you're going to allow guys into the Hall of Fame that were using steroids? I don't care if it was something that was just a fad back in the early 2000s. It doesn't matter. It should not matter. If you played the game clean, you should be in. No question about it. So those are kind of, my thoughts and my picks for some fringe players that will make it in. Some players that you would think would make it in aren't going to make it in, and then some players that would have absolutely no shot of making it into the Hall of Fame. So that'll do it for this segment, folks. Thanks again for sticking around. But stay right there because we will be right back after this commercial break for the final segment today, where I will share my thoughts on what 2021 will look like for fans and how experiencing MLB games will look like as a spectator as well. Don't go anywhere, everyone, because we have one last segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
Want to know the latest in soccer? Then listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast. From MLS, the World Cup, and the Premier League, we've got you covered. The latest updates, the hottest matches, and news on the league's top players. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast.
David Beckham scores the goal to take England all the way to the World Cup final.
Listen now.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for the final segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Jack Ridenauer still with you, and in the last segment, I discussed the recent Hall of Fame ballot with the finalists for this year's induction, and mentioned which players I think will be able to make it to Cooperstown, and which were probably going to be long shots, if anything. I want to wrap up today with discussing a topic I've become incredibly fascinated with, and that is what baseball will look like next year, in terms of watching games and just being at the ballpark. And as we know, with this past season and with this past year and really just with everything that's been going on in the world, going to baseball or really just going to any professional sporting event is kind of an afterthought, not really a thing that people go and do anymore as a fun get-together or fun outing in the town or whatever it normally has been in the past. And so as a result, this makes it a very unusual year that going to sporting events becomes kind of a frowned-upon thing and something that's actually now outlawed. So this past year, baseball obviously experimented with having fans on a limited capacity at the World Series. And I actually had a very good friend of mine go to the World Series. He was a huge Rays fan, and he was able to get tickets. Him and his dad have had tickets for, 15, 20 years for season tickets for the Tampa Bay Rays. He's from Tampa Bay, so that explains a lot. And he told me, I remember him telling me, hey, man, I just got World Series tickets. I can't wait to go. He got tickets for, I believe, Games 6 and 7. Now, as we know, there was no Game 7, but he wound up actually driving to Arlington from Pittsburgh. And he met his dad there. I believe his dad flew from Florida over, and they met up in Arlington. And just a really cool thing for him. He was able to go to Game 5. I believe he tried to go to Game 4, if I'm not mistaken. But I asked him, I said, hey, what was it like, going to a game in this pandemic? I mean, what was that experience? I mean, and he said, it honestly just felt like a normal baseball game. You just knew that there wasn't as many people. You obviously had to sit in your pods because they sold tickets in fours. So they had, 4 sections, sectioned off, and then they would have a huge gap in between, and they would have 4 other seats sectioned off and whatever else. So as a result, it looked kind of weird. He said it did look a little unusual, but he said people weren't really that strict about wearing masks. I mean, everybody's either eating or drinking, so there's not really going to be any mask wearing, I would say. And for the most part, lines seem to move pretty quickly. I think he said the food was pretty much ready made. Ready to go right off. Right out. When you go to a baseball game and you kind of have the heating area where that the food kind of sits to stay warm. He said the food was always just ready to go. They just grabbed it, and again, they want to limit people gathering in crowds and potentially having somebody that may or may not have it spreading to everybody else, and because everyone's around, now everybody gets it. And I get that. I obviously completely understand that. But what I'm very curious about is, could this have been an experiment also to see kind of what baseball might look like in 2021 in terms of teams, and again, this might also be subject to change, mainly because I think a lot of teams are probably going to abide by whatever the state regulations are. And I know in Texas, they were allowing, 25 or 50% capacity at outdoor sporting events. And obviously this year, with basketball and hockey kind of starting to creep up here very, very soon, probably won't have any fans in the stands for those games, obviously. But for baseball, in some states, it might be all right to go to a baseball game. Now, here's a couple questions that I have and kind of things to think about, really, as follow-ups, especially if there is fans that actually happen. One, how much are those tickets going to be? I mean, some of those tickets are probably going to be astronomical. And a lot of people I've talked to, I said, hey, you know what? I wouldn't be shocked if some people did not jack up the prices on their tickets, if some teams did not do that. Why? Because of this. A lot of people don't have jobs. A lot of people aren't making any money right now. And as a result, people don't want to go and spend an arm and a leg for going to a baseball game at limited capacity. And who knows if the team in that town is any good. And if they're going to be actually getting a bang for their buck, going to a, again, quarter-filled baseball game, watching a really bad baseball team. People aren't going to want to pay $250 for, possible nosebleed seats all the way up in the, upper deck. And that's actually kind of another thought that I had is, could we see some of these larger stands? Again, I don't know, I don't remember seeing many people. I don't really remember paying much attention to the stands during the World Series, but they could just, again, a lot of these stands have massive upper deck areas where they could really spread some people out, and they could potentially, get a little bit more people to come into the games and come into the stadium. So my one thing is, how much are these tickets going to cost? Two, how are they going to figure out whether or not somebody has been in contact or possibly contracted COVID? And I saw something the other day. I don't know if it was on TV or if it was an article. I didn't really get into it. I should have, but I didn't. And it said something that either Ticketmaster or StubHub, one of the two, they're going to start only allowing fans to come in and purchase tickets, really, if they've had a negative COVID-19 test within the 72-hour, 48-hour period where they, ordered the tickets. And I think on the app, whichever app it is, they literally will not allow you to buy tickets unless you check off that you've had a COVID-19 test. Now, how are they going to be able to regulate that? I have no idea. I personally am not going to be going to any professional sporting event until this all blows over and people are allowed to just go into the stands and pack the house. And let me tell you what, that's going to be a very weird experience when that happens. People, I think, are going to be it's going to be a culture shock, if you will, because we're used to not having big crowds. We're used to not gathering in large, collections. Now, whenever baseball goes back to normal and there's a vaccine and things, again, life goes back to normal, because this will not, I personally believe, will not be something that happens for 15, 20, 25 years or whatever. This will probably still linger around for maybe the next year or two, at the latest, I think. But as time goes on, normalcy will kick back in, I believe. So my thing is, when you go back to the game and fans and stands are going to be completely filled, stadiums are going to be just jam-packed with people, it's going to be a culture shock. It'll be interesting to see how people feel being around that many people in a crowded area, wondering, does somebody have something that could be easily spread? Could somebody still have COVID and, it could spread everywhere or whatever it might be? And that could be a major worry. But again, I go back to my original point of how are they going to know if you've actually had a test unless there's some sort of photo documentation that you need to show that you've had a negative result come back and that you are okay to go to a game. Now, here's the other problem, though. People could fake that. People could make something up. People could try and, again, it's the day and age we live in. People are able to figure out somehow, some way of not having to, follow those kind of guidelines, especially with just all the different, technological ways that you can get away with that. So how are they going to know if somebody is actually telling the truth? And then if they have actually not even been tested and they, lo and behold, do have COVID, and then they come to the stadium and they spread it to everybody else, that's going to be a major problem, not only probably for the team, but also probably for the ticket company for saying, yeah, we gave that person tickets, we gave them the okay, they said that they were all right. How are we supposed to know? So then it gets into kind of that, back and forth of, who's right and who's wrong. So I think that, those are two main things to definitely look at is, the ticket prices to these things, and then just obviously, whether or not these ticket companies are going to make people actually check off that they've had a COVID-19 test. And then the other thing is this. just the average, normal game day experience. What is that going to be like? And I've seen actually some things where some stadiums are trying to get kind of those hot ovens, or I don't know what you call them, the warming ovens, or wherever you are able to put, food under a warm light and it just keeps them warm. Apparently people are able to, or stadiums are trying to get those built more throughout the stadiums in some places in order to, A, cut down on lines, B, make people order food from, their seat. They can just punch it into an app or whatever it might be, and then they go up, they've got an order ticket, they've got a number, and they go up, it's on their phone, the ticket, the receipt's there, they just grab it, and they go, and then that's that, and you avoid any sort of crowds being, and you probably get some sort of notification on your phone saying, okay, your food is ready, please go and get it, and then you go and get it, or whatever. So I think that ultimately this game day experience is going to be very odd. People probably, stadiums might not want to sell as much alcohol. Stadiums might not want to sell as much food, because people could just say, hey, I'm going to just buy food the entire time and drinks the entire time. If I was able to afford these tickets, I can afford, buying lots of food and drink, and I don't have to wear my mask at all. And then it kind of deters people from following those guidelines. So there's going to be ways that people are going to try and get out of this. And even watching the World Series, I mean, you could see when they would flash over to the stands and everything, not many people were wearing masks. And obviously, you would see a beer can in one of the cup holders, or somebody was eating something. So obviously, people aren't going to be wearing masks when that's happening. But then what's going to say that they're going to put it right back on if there's, A, nobody going around and checking, and B, if they do have a drink in their cup holder, they're going to argue, well, I am drinking actively. I do have a water out, or I do have a lemonade out, or I do have a Bud Light out, or whatever it might be. Leave me alone. I'm not putting my mask on. And then that causes a whole other issue in itself. And another thing is, how are these ushers going to handle that? I mean, I think a lot of these teams, they're going to have to put a lot of responsibility on these ushers and these people that are at the top of these sections, showing people to their seats, saying, and the teams are going to have to let them know, hey, you've got to come down a little bit harder on people than you normally do, mainly because people could not follow these rules. People could just say, I'm not wearing my mask, I'm sitting and I'm not facing anybody, I'm not going to put it on. And it's going to have to put a little bit more responsibility on the ushers also to potentially have to kind of delegate and make sure that guidelines are being followed. And so I think your game day experience, all in all, in 2021 is going to be the most different that we've ever seen. And it's definitely going to affect a lot of teams. I've mentioned it already in this episode. A lot of teams are starting to try and save money. They don't want to spend as much money this upcoming season because of these COVID-19, or what they're calling pandemic losses. And I understand that. I understand why some guys might get traded or might get released, or something might happen because they can't afford them, or they don't want to afford to to pay them, or whatever it might be. So all in all, this is affecting so much, especially in baseball. And another thing is, what is spring training going to look like for the guys? And I was actually, I know a couple minor league guys that are, active minor leaguers now, and I've been asking them kind of what is the news with your team moving forward? What is something that you guys have been talking about, or what has your, respective team told you about, this upcoming season? And everybody that I've talked to that's in the minors says, well, there's a tentative date as to when we're supposed to report back to spring training. Whether or not that is going to be upheld or be moved, I don't know. And so I totally understand, they're kind of, it's a lot of uncertainty, and they just they don't really know what's going to happen. And so as a result, spring training could be totally affected. How will that affect guys, seasons? And, obviously we saw a lot of guys this past year that they had a rushed spring training. They probably weren't able to get a whole lot of access to any fields when the pandemic was at its peak and when it first started. So that's why you probably saw a lot of star players not have great years this year. Not enough time to prepare. Same thing that we've seen in the NFL. For anybody out there that's a big football fan, a lot of guys have been getting a lot of injuries because there wasn't much training camp. They're not allowed to have full contact practices. Same thing with baseball. If you're not able to go to spring training, and you're not able to go and take a live BP, you're not able to take, a live scrimmage, you're not able to see a live pitcher, you're going to be thrown into a season where all of a sudden you're used to not see, you haven't seen, that type of speed or a breaking ball that breaks, from 12 inches up to down to 6 inches. You haven't seen that in over a year. You're going to be completely out of rhythm. No wonder you're not going to have a great season. Guys like Christian Yelich did not have a great year. Cody Bellinger did not have a great year. And so ultimately, I just think that at the end of the day, this is just going to be a very, very unique season. And I think that even though this past season was very unique, I don't know if they really had all the time in the world to plan it out. And I think that's what's going to be different for 2021. They've got all this time now. They got this season over with. It's in their it's in the past. They've dealt with it. It's done. Now let's go from this point moving forward and figure out all of the logistics for next year, so we can come and present kind of a project, or kind of project or present a game plan to players, managers, personnel, front office executives, fans who want to go, whatever. And we can say, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to go about it. We've had time to prepare now. It's not, and again, a lot of people don't realize, when all of this was trying to be figured out, there was also collective bargaining agreements. The MLBPA was going back and forth with the MLB about pay this year and how many games there's going to be. So there was other things that went on during this, very odd and peculiar time that I think also set back a couple other agendas that they needed to lay out, and other kind of strategies that they needed to implement. And as a result, we kind of got back to the old, we had 60 games, and the original offer by the MLB was 82 games. So they lost 22 games because of the counter arguments and the counter offers and this, that, and the other. And then as a result, you could tell the baseball season was just kind of slapped together. You had teams that were having outbreaks on their team. You had guys that were not following protocol. Well, you don't really have a whole lot of time to implement a whole lot of protocol if you're dealing with the MLB Player Association, and guys are not happy about pay, guys are not happy about how many games are going to be happening, guys are not happy about them having to risk their lives and risk their health, risk their family's health, and even potentially, a lot of things were going around about whether or not there was going to be a bubble, and that was a whole nother ordeal. So there was a lot of things that circled around the MLB season as a result of this pandemic. And I think that in 2021, a lot of this will probably be ironed out. These executives, these people in the MLB that are going to be making these plans and making these decisions, Rob Manfred being one of the main people, he's going to be able to have time to figure things out, and he's going to be able to figure out a game plan as to how to go about this in the most logistical, safest, and, best way possible to try and, again, keep people safe, but also try and, bring in some sort of revenue so the MLB doesn't really have a catastrophic year. So I'm really curious to see how this season's going to wind up. I'm really curious to see, what kind of unfolds. And all I know is that whenever the day is, and I've said this many times on the show, but whenever the day is that I can go back and see an MLB game, and I can go to PNC Park, I can watch the Pittsburgh Pirates, I can get a bucket of wings, and I can just sit and enjoy and watch a nice baseball game on a nice warm summer day, that's going to be one of the most glorifying experiences coming out of this, without question. And that's, I think, when we'll all know that things are back to normal, when we can just go catch baseball. Obviously there will be other things that we'll notice that will be normal, but being able to go to a major, sporting event and going to a professional sporting event, that's definitely going to be a big thing also. So I'm looking forward to that day, but 2021, it's going to be a weird baseball season without doubt. So that'll wrap it up for us here today. Thank you again for listening to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, we would really appreciate that. And as always, everyone, thanks so much for joining me today. And until next time, have a fantastic day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.